shout out, fam, for those of you who are born from immigrant parents or you're dating somebody who has an immigrant lineage and background. Congratulations. You are totally human. And I mean this by saying, yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. And shout out to my white friends who, some folks may think that you may not have generational trauma, but obviously you have ancestral lineage. You come from different places all across the globe, and you probably have mixed heritage in you. So I'm definitely not forgetting you guys in this conversation here. But the way that I have evolved into expressing trauma and even talking about trauma is something that happened to you, that maybe it was a visceral moment in your life. It has shaped the way that you are. Maybe it shaped the way that subconsciously or consciously, the way that you engage in relationships, the way that you engage in conversation, the way that you even process your emotions. We always talk about sexual trauma, right? Something that happened to you when you were young and that there was no control over it. But it could also look like trauma of being ignored by your parents. Maybe the fact that they wanted you to be a tennis star and you hated tennis, you despised tennis. So then they made you feel even more worse when you weren't doing and following the path that they laid out for you. That is an example of a trauma. So trauma expands basically the whole gamut, and we're learning a lot more into concepts and research that's now really focused in what we call epigenetics, and how basically there's non-coding DNA that makes up around 98% of our DNA. Yes, 98% of our DNA. And that's really all about how we have our personality traits, how we process our emotions, what came up when our parents and their parents before them were going through something, maybe genocide, maybe it was leaving a home country, maybe it was being a refugee, maybe it was losing their home, losing a family member, rape, death, divorce. And the list goes on. It didn't start with you. Family trauma shapes who we are and how to end the cycle. Okay, this is a phenomenal book if you want to dive into it. It's with Mark Wolin. He is a researcher, he's a psychologist, and he literally goes into a lot of And yes, he gets geeky. He gets geeky into the science behind it. So if you're that kind of a person that wants to understand and learn a lot more about the basics and the genesis around transgenerational trauma or generational trauma in general, and how the biology behind the non-coded DNA gets implanted into our bodies. So for instance, if let's just say your grandfather was in the Holocaust, parts of your DNA, even though it was your grandfather that was involved in the Holocaust, parts of your DNA will be affected by how you are now able to manage stress, your cortisol response. And there's a whole list of studies that he goes through over and over again in all of the different chapters around how that is now making you either more susceptible to stress. So in many ways, your cells are more resilient, right? Which is in some ways a good thing. But then also you are more prone to having anxiety disorders and even depression and other mood-related disorders than somebody else who didn't have a parent or a grandparent that went through something like that. And growing up with immigrant parents, they did want the best for me. They definitely prided themselves on legacy, especially on pride, as well as educational drive for success, meaning that nothing else, like I could get #1 in piano or dance competitions or anything else, but nothing mattered, because at the end of the day, if I wasn't bringing home A's, then it did not matter. And I know many of you listening to this coming from those backgrounds are like, yep, me too. Oh yeah, didn't want to share, when I failed a test, or didn't want to share when I didn't get a great score on my ACTs or SATs or whatever the case was. And there's almost a sense of shame and guilt. And I know that for me, when I was going through some major life transitions, when it was a career change, I know that even when I was in high school, I remember that, we were going through just the thickness of the losses. I had just lost my mom and we had just lost my brother, and I was applying to colleges. In fact, my brother had passed literally right in the thickness of like senior year, and I was trying to do early admission for some of these colleges. Shout out to you all overachievers who did early admission. And yeah, my world stopped. My world completely shattered and stopped. And it was, in October. And I had to grieve the loss that I would potentially go away to college. Instead, I went and I stayed in Chicago so I could be close with my father. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that trauma was so big and so huge that I literally had to just sit. But there was still that expectation. There was still that expectation from my father that, okay, this major life trauma that has literally shattered our family has happened, and focus on your schoolwork because that'll help us. Focus on your schoolwork because you're not literally, he didn't really say these words, but it almost felt like he did, where this trauma is too big to bear. The emotions are too big to bear. So at least you can focus on your studies. And I know that there's a lot of dialogue and conversations on, the humor in having immigrant parents, because no matter what happens, focus on your studies. Like, that is the solution. Get therapy. Nope. Focus on your studies. That's the solution. And I mean, my father was he was so great because he had such a spiritual background. He would meditate on the weekends. I remember, Sundays were totally devoted for him to is meditating sometimes 2 to 3 hours a day. And I remember growing up, literally, my brothers and I, we would just run into his room as he was chanting his meditations, because he would do chants, and he would have his mala beads, and we would always play with them, put it on our heads, and wear them as necklaces. But he literally had this ritualistic practice every Sunday that he would do these really long meditations, especially when my mom was nearing the end of her life. So he was so focused on making sure that we were going to get the support that we needed. So we did talk therapy. We would do these things where we would go into these workshops and throw things and get out our anger. And he was very much a proponent of taking us outside and even shifting our environment for a little bit. I remember going to California to seeing one of our family friends when we were really little, when this entire ordeal happened. But my dad would always ask me, and who knows if it was because he wanted me to focus on my studies. Now looking back, maybe it was a protective mechanism. Maybe it was a way for us to connect. Again, he was doing the best that he could, because his father, guess what, wanted him to be a doctor. His father was a diplomat. He worked for the Indian government. He was a diplomat, and he literally traveled all across the world, from Russia to Afghanistan to even Iran. I mean, he's been everywhere. This is my grandfather. Okay. So crazy to think that he had really high expectations for my father. And my father upped and he left after my grandfather died. And mind you, my grandfather passed away of a heart attack. He was an entertainer and he loved bringing people together. So he would bring around dignitaries and people from different parts of the world. And he was very much one with really embracing culture, because he was traveling back then. You guys, my dad was born in 1947. He was traveling the world in the 40s. Think about that. And for those of you who are literally, your lineage is from India, we had the partition in 1947. So if your family members, maybe grandparents or maybe even your parents, were born around that time, think about that time for a second. And I know we don't need to get into the history, but that was a huge undertaking. Literally 1 million people and correct me if I'm wrong, but look it up, but 1 million people died in migrating because of all sorts of reasons, throughout India when the partition was happening between India and Pakistan. That is huge. My aunt, my bua, was born in 1947 during the partition. Now, she was a baby. She wouldn't know, but knowing what I know now about generational trauma and what perhaps maybe affected the stress levels that affected her mom when she was born, I know that my aunt has a very short fuse. I know that she can't typically emotionally regulate herself as much as she would like to. And if you see that with your family members, look into what was happening when they were growing up. What was happening when they were born? Were they going through some sort of oppression? Were they going through some sort of, slavery? Were they going through some sort of, was there something big happening? A migration, leaving a country because they were fearing their life? There's a lot of things that go into, and I'm talking about the epigenetics of the time that they were growing up in. So you may be as mad as you want that your parents are not letting you live your legacy and pursuing your purpose, but it goes deeper than that, you guys. And that's why I'm so diving in and digging this work right now by Mark Wolin and Maureen Selené, because it's huge. This can really help heal your relationships with your family.